Matthew Phelps, co-author of the Turning to God's Word Bible study, The Revelation of Jesus Christ, the Faithful Witness. Today we'll be talking about lesson 4 of our study, which covers the book of Revelation, chapter 3. Yes. Introduction. In this lesson, we will continue what we began in the previous one, which is a walk through these letters to these 7 churches. If you don't remember the context around a lot of what's going on here, watching the intro segment to the last video would be a good refresher. But the key high points that we're looking at, to remind everyone, myself included, is that these 7 letters are a restatement of the 7 days of creation. Only now, instead of creating the world, we're creating the church. And the interesting difference and important difference between the two is when God speaks to inanimate water, it does what he says. When God speaks to people, we do not necessarily do what he says. There is a step after that. God speaks to us the thing that is meant to bring about a change in creation, reality, the world, that brings about what he's trying to do ultimately with all of this. And then we have to execute on what he tells us to do, and we have the ability to choose to do that or to choose to not do that. And what happens as a result is contingent upon not only what God wants, but what you and I want. Or will, better than want, because we can will things that we don't want, and sometimes Christianity will ask us to do that. The will is the choice we make, right? It's very literally our exercising of what's in our mind out onto reality itself, and in so doing, we change reality. So God is trying to take this final step in the creation of the world through us. All the steps that led to us existing, he spoke, the world responded, easy, no problem. Then we get to this last step. He speaks not to the world, but to us. And we're meant to respond, and that's meant to shape reality. And that gets harder. And that is this last phase of creation, or this latest, I should say, phase of creation that we're involved in. And so these 7 letters mirror the 7 days of creation in showing us that the church is a new creation and is ushering in a new creation. And the key thing that it is reminding us of is it's God speaking, and it's we as church meant to listen and to respond and to exercise our will to make choices in accord with the things that God is telling us to do. He's telling all these churches, but through them he's speaking also to us. And we are meant to hear, to obey, to respond, to carry out the things that he's telling us. And that is our role as church. And it's an ordering and a unifying of human will with Christ as the head, right? And so we see as that happens, tribulation, conflict between that unified, ordered exercise of human will and the chaos of people who aren't doing that and who are, not to spoil where the book is going, but who will end up serving the devil by their free exercise of that choice, free and selfish and disordered exercise of that will. Whether they mean to be serving the devil or not, it turns out if you're not choosing to serve God, you're choosing to serve the devil. We'll see that a lot. But it creates a tremendous amount of conflict, right? That conflict between order and chaos, good and evil, God and devil, us and them, hopefully us, maybe them and maybe we're the them. But that's the whole point, is we're wanting to be on Team God, right? And we get there by what we do. And so these letters are urging us to make radical and important choices toward God, showing us what happens if we do and what happens if we don't. Next church. This will be our 5th of the 7 churches that we talk about, to the church in Sardis. I know your works. You have the name of being alive, and you are dead. Awake and strengthen what remains and is on the point of death, for I have not found your works perfect in the sight of my God. Remember then what you received and heard. Keep that and repent. If you will not awake, I will come like a thief, and you will not know at what hour I will come upon you. Yet you have still a few names in Sardis, people who have not soiled their garments, and they shall walk with me in white, for they are worthy. Okay, Sardis has a problem. There are a few interesting things that we see here, as in all of these. One, God's not going to judge every person in the community according to the actions of the community. If you're surrounded by people who aren't getting it right and you somehow manage to persevere, you don't get dragged down. This isn't a group project. This is an individual project. Other people failing does not make you fail, which is important, right? Because the church is a body of Christ. It's easy to start to feel like other people are compromising the church that we live in sometimes, and they do make it harder for us. Right? Community is a powerful and an important part of this. Being in a good, supportive, encouraging church community is hugely beneficial to us as we are trying to do this. So I'm not trying to say the community we're in doesn't matter. It surely matters. But we can pass even when our whole community is failing. Harder, but doable. So we see that. But we also see... Right, these are people who are taking the name of Christian, but are not really endeavoring to do what they've been told, right? I would venture to say this is probably not a region where you're going to be killed for being Christian. We saw in the previous lesson there were some communities where Christianity was literally a matter of life and death. And by being Christian, you were probably putting your life on the line. You'll note that those people didn't seem very eager to be Christian and not be really doing it very seriously, because they are putting themselves in mortal peril to do it at all. Whereas when it gets easier and more comfortable, it's much easier to do it faker. And again, so much carryover in all of these things to our world today. As I am likely not to be asked to give my life for being Christian, it's easy to raise my hand when people are asking for Christians, and then to go into the privacy of my home and do things that have nothing to do with Jesus. Or in my church, in the way I treat people in my church community, or all the time at work, to certainly not act like Christian people would. It's so easy to raise my hand and be counted, and then to not really mean it. And that seems here like the primary criticism of the people in Sardis, and it won't be the only church where some degree of, we'll call it apathy. I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit, but this is clearly not like being on fire for wanting to keep to the teaching and what God is asking us to do. It becomes a thing when Christianity becomes just a label you add on top of yourself, and you live your life like you were going to anyway. You're doing what the people in Sardis are doing, right? It's, I'm living the same life I was always going to live, but I'll call myself Christian, and then when I die, maybe Jesus will see that, and maybe there's eternal reward for that. And how hard is it to be baptized and to call myself Christian? Good way to hedge my bets. Except it's not. It doesn't work that way. Because Christianity that doesn't radically change your life is not being Christian. And so when we, myself included, try to live that way, it merits us nothing, and it could be worse than not doing it at all. Because in applying the name Christian to ourselves, we are adding on accountability, right? by calling myself Christian, Jesus is expecting me to act like he does. If I didn't take the name, if I didn't say I am associating myself with Jesus Christ, then I'm not necessarily having to be held to the standard of acting like Jesus Christ. But as soon as I say, yes, I am associated with Jesus Christ, and I act like somebody who's not, I have done worse than nothing. And that's the problem here. And it's a problem of our age. There are a lot of these Christians who are doing worse than nothing. And some of them are Catholics, and some of them aren't. And some of the ones who aren't Catholics are doing better than a lot of the ones who are Catholics. It's across the church and all denominations that this is a problem. So what's our takeaway is, again, our choice that we make has to be to stay true. We talked a lot in the last lesson about knowing that good doctrine and choosing that. But it's walking and living in imitation of Jesus Christ, whose name we dare to take upon ourselves. That is not a small thing to do. To claim Christ means Christ claims you, and you bear a responsibility for that. And if you just take the name lightly and vainly, you will not like where that goes, is the point here. So, listen, obey, carry out, bring about in the world. For our sixth church, we get the church in Philadelphia, and not Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. We haven't done etymology for the rest of these, but Philadelphia means brotherly love. It seems like this community is aptly named. These are people who are doing a good job in a hard situation, right? I know your works. Behold, I have set before you an open door, which no one is able to shut. I know that you have but little power, and yet you have kept my word and have not denied my name. And again, themes, patient endurance, right? In the midst of tribulation and conflict. That is what is winning these people accolades. We've seen it previously as well in some of these other letters. This is a thing God likes a lot. When the conflict with the world comes and people persevere and say, no, I choose God. I continue to choose God. And to choose God in a way that is rooted in solid doctrine. As we started going through these with this idea of them instructing the choices we're supposed to make, I thought there were going to be like dozens of different choices over the course of 7 churches. There are just a couple, right? It's really simple. Persevere in tribulation. Don't be led astray by false doctrine, and be willing to keep persevering even to the point of death. That's kind of it. That is the church on earth. I expected it to be more complicated, but as we're talking about it, it doesn't need to be, right? The details of what it means to follow and to persevere, and what good doctrine are, right? Those sorts of things are why we do Bible study, to better understand. This isn't trying to deep dive into what those choices look like and how we know the right iteration of them. Very important. But here we're just concentrating on what is the continual act of will of a Christian meant to look like, and where is it directed? And that is, as it turns out, simple. I will say simple and not easy, because it's not easy, but it is simple, which is an important thing to keep in mind. And we will come back to these themes throughout this book, because we'll see that conflict between the church and the world, and we'll see it play out a lot. And I think we'll be able to see, in fact, I'm certain we'll be able to see in many of those cases that interplay between the people who are church and are rewarded are ultimately the people making these couple of choices consistently. And it's not a one-time thing. It is a consistent thing. And that is Christianity lived, is orienting ourselves toward God, and in every opportunity that presents itself in our lives, taking the action that leads toward God instead of the action that leads away from God. That's it. But you have to do it continuously and over and over. And that's what makes you Christian. And when you start veering a little bit, it's okay to, get off course a little bit and to course correct and to find your way back. God does not expect any of us to be perfect. But what we become is where we're headed and choosing directionally. It's not one bad decision, usually. It's the culmination of a lot, right? Example, weight loss is a big thing in our culture because a lot of people, again, myself included, are too fat. It turns out that what you weigh is the sum total of the habitual and continuous choices that you make, right? And you can try to fix that by making radically different unsustainable and radically different choices for a period of time, and that's not going to work very well. And you're going to find yourself right back where you were, or worse, right? Because what you haven't done is reoriented the directionality of the choices you're making, right? You're still ultimately making fat people choices, and sometimes your divergence is to sometimes make radically not fat people choices, but your overall directionality, trend, and inclination is still fat people choices. And so you are going to stay fat or get fat again as long as that continues to be the orientation and the directionality of the choices you're making. Whereas if you can fundamentally reorient your choices toward making healthy weight people choices, then maybe sometimes you still eat too much and you have a bad day, and it ultimately doesn't matter because that directionality is pulling you constantly back toward ultimately being a healthy weighted person, because that's the sum total and the majority of the choices that you make and kind of the resting default state of the choices that you make. Christianity is that, right? You can either be the sum total and default state of the choices you make can be toward Jesus, or they can be toward not Jesus. And your ultimate fate is not going to, barring a really bad choice, depend on one thing that you do, right? There can be a really good or really bad choice that can change your ultimate fate and destiny if it happens at exactly the right moment or wrong moment in time. But by and large, our destiny is made of the sum total general directionality and inclination of the choices we make. So are you generally acting like a person who can wear the name of Christ as a part of your identity as a Christian, or as a not Christian? Where you end up is defined by that totality of the choices that you make. You don't get to have a really good Lent one year after disregarding Jesus all the time and be good and covered for the year, right? That's like crash dieting, right? Which you might also be doing during Lent, coincidentally, depending on how you use the season of Lent. That's the sort of thing that doesn't work because it's not changing the inclination of all your broader scope of direction of decisions. It's just acting against it for a little while and then going back to where you were, and rebounding and doing as bad or worse as you did before. So the big lesson here in all of these letters is that we have to ingrain in ourselves the habit of the vast majority and sum total of our choices being directionally aimed at Jesus Christ. And if we do that, we're living as Christians. And if we don't do that, we have a very serious problem. A deadly problem. And I would say that that is the point of all of these letters, is to show different communities and individuals and to highlight, it's showing Jesus is commenting on the directionality of these people based on the choices they're making, right? Like you're moving toward heaven. I don't want to be you. You doing okay, do a little bit better here and you've got it. Whoops. And that's what it is. It's commenting on the sum total of the choices these groups of people are making and the direction it's moving them in. How would you do if Jesus were to analyze your life that way? What is the direction, the sum total of your choices is leading you in? If you don't like the answer, that's the thing you should work on immediately because you don't know how much time you have. It's the thing you should work on urgently. But again, it can't be just like that crash diet form of working on it. Like, oh, I saw this video and now, I have this emotional arousal toward fearing for my immortal soul. So I'm going to say a couple rosaries for a week and then I'll be good for a while. I won't be as worried about it. That initial stimulus will wear off and I'll go back to how I was acting before. That doesn't do it. It's hard to make that kind of change. It's why so many people fail at weight loss, to continue on the example. It is hard to change the directionality and the sum total of our decisions. It takes discipline, mindfulness, awareness. In some cases, therapy or professional help can be a great idea. Outside of and inside of the faith, it takes all of our effort to change that directionality, right? It can't be a thing you do halfway. Most people don't halfway manage to change their weight. If you really want to change and keep a different weight, at least for a while, you have to be all in. If you want to overcome other addictive behavior, for a while, you have to go all in, right? Scorched earth on the old behaviors and decisions you don't want to keep making. Make it extraordinarily hard to go back to doing what you were doing before. It takes everything to make the change, but it gets easier, right? Eventually you become a new person, new identity. The general trajectory of your decisions is leading you toward where you want to be. Once it kicks in, it's great because you've set yourself up for success. And all you have to do to get to where you want to go is to keep doing what you're doing, which is what Jesus says here. To these people, he says, great, keep it up, you're good. All you have to do is keep doing what you're doing. You don't have to do anything else. You get the right habits, the right inclination in place, and you have a lifestyle that supports salvation. That's Christianity, right? That's living a Christian life. You don't always have to be fighting yourself. You always have to be fighting the world, but you don't always have to be fighting yourself. You can make enough progress that your default position is most of the time going to be good enough to be moving you towards salvation. And what a thing to aspire to. But it takes going all in for a long time, or longer than is comfortable, before that starts to happen. And until you get there, you have to be willing to give it everything. And if you hold anything back, you're probably not going to get there. Anyway, the decisions we make create our destiny and the destiny of the world. And the church is intended to guide those decisions for followers of Christ toward bringing about a new and better world for all of us. And now to the seventh church. In some ways, we've saved the best for last, and in other ways, we've more accurately saved the worst for last. This is the church in Laodicea. And their issue, we alluded to this a little bit in another case, is complacency, being lukewarm, right? And we set it up a little bit too. This is the hard one, right? This is you take upon, and unfortunately one of the bigger problems I think of our age, you take upon yourself the name of Christian and it has no more effect on you than just a label you assign, right? And you think you get to decide for yourself what that means, which is sort of true, but not at all, right? Because it's Christ's name you're taking onto yourself. You don't decide who Christ is. So you should not be able to decide what that means to take his name for yourself, right? The arrogance and presumption and beginning to assign for yourself what it means to be Christian is appalling. If you actually have any belief in Jesus Christ, how do you think that you get to decide what it means to take his name for yourself? The arrogance of that is unbelievable, and it's prevalent in our age. I can be Christian however I want to. Well, no, you can't. And it can mean whatever I want it to me. Well, no, it can't. If it doesn't resemble Christ, it's not Christian. Like, no, you're lying about who you are then. Probably more than anything to yourself. But that's also the kind of mentality that leads to this being lukewarm, right? It's when we, and that's where all of this comes into play at once, because when you accept false teachings, false ideas about what Christianity is, this false notion of it, it can be a thing that is void of urgency or certitude or passion, right? It starts to be like other human things that become dull and blah because of how far it gets from Christ. And the interesting thing is Christ would be happier with people who are really against than with people who are completely lukewarm. Because at least there's a sense of getting it, right? There's a sense of, there is Jesus Christ, and he has demands that following him make. And I'm either, yes, I'm in, that's great, I like that, or I hate that, that's awful. Both are acknowledging who Christ is, and are making and acting on a choice on that basis. Neither is entirely denying the reality of Jesus Christ. This lukewarm thing does, right? To be confronted with the idea that God became man and say that doesn't matter. What a thing. And that's the predominant attitude of our age, is that doesn't even matter. And that is, as we see, the worst decision that could be made. And unfortunately, these days, it is the most common, even among people taking the name and calling themselves Christian. This is, if we take, well, I think what we talked about in the last question is the primary takeaway. If you take anything away, work on that directionality of your choices and moving toward Christ in everything you do. Second key takeaway is don't do this. Do not be lukewarm. Do not say out loud or in your heart that Christ doesn't matter. And we can do it in some things and not others, right? It tends to be more of an all or nothing thing, but it's easy to carve out parts of our life for God and parts of our life for not God. And as soon as you do that, you start down the pathway of Christ doesn't matter, right? Because you don't get to be halfway Christian. That's not a thing. You're all Christian or you're not Christian. You're not halfway there. That trying to be halfway is the gateway to being lukewarm. And in fact, you're pretty well through the gate by the time you're trying to be halfway Christian at all. That's what starts that way of thinking, and that's the logical conclusion of that pathway is some form of Christ not mattering. You can't do it halfway. There are no half measures in Christianity. You are all in or you are not in. And that is a very uncomfortable thing to think about. Not just to talk about it on the video, it's a very uncomfortable thing for me to think about as I'm talking about it right now. Because I'm not doing that. But that's what the text here is telling us, right? Is that's what it means to be a Christian. It's all or nothing. Can't say it better than that, so I'll just reiterate the point. It is all or nothing. You have to be all in to be Christian. You have to give it everything you have. Christ does not demand perfection, but he demands the effort, right? You have to be trying to give everything. And anything, if you take one thing in your life and say, I'm going to put that over here, and this isn't for Jesus, and the rest is, it doesn't work. You have flirted with, at best, damnation. At worst, more than flirted with. You can't do it that way. And that's hard. And, that doesn't reconcile very well with how our age likes to view Christianity. But that's a good thing, right? It's the point. Because our age is in this lukewarm, imagine how we would feel as a culture, as a society about Christianity, if all the people that we actually called Christian and commented on were all in, instead of all these lukewarm, let's just use politicians as an example because it's easy, but our neighbors could just as well be the example. People claiming Christianity and doing non-Christian things. Pick your political party. One of the last two presidents was somebody who claims to be Christian and is doing things that are not Christian. For sure, one of them, and definitely both of them, were in that camp. Not all in on Christianity. What would our world look like if they were? Or if they didn't claim Christianity, if they're not going to be all in on it? It complicates everything when the majority of Christians we see are lukewarm. It makes it so hard, and it leads people away from the faith. But what they're rejecting isn't the faith. They're rejecting these Christians who are taking upon themselves a name that they do not deserve, and toward which they are apathetic. Don't be apathetic toward Jesus. I could comment more, but anything else I think will be ranting, and you get the point. The text here, as we're studying the Bible, urges us not to be apathetic toward Christ and to work ever to have the sum total of the decisions we make in our life be drawing us ever toward and closer to Christ. And that will be the thing that brings about a new creation in our world and a new state for humanity. The church will change the world, but it will change it through the choices that you and I make. This has been an overview of Lesson 4 of the Turning to God's Word Bible Study, the revelation of Jesus Christ, the faithful witness. For more information, consult our written study and visit us online at turningtogodsword.com.